Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about health compromising behaviors, including smoking and alcoholism. The objectives of today's lecture are understanding the meaning and history of alcoholism, understanding the stages of alcoholism, understanding the effects of alcoholism, understanding the meaning and history of smoking, understanding the effects of smoking on health, history of alcoholism. Evidence of beer jugs and pictographs of alcoholic beverage consumption exist from as far back as around 10,000 BC. The fermented beverages being made in China date back to 7,000 BC. There's even Greek literature from thousands of years ago that talks about the dangers of abusing alcohol. In 1877, an archaeologist, James Death, suggested that the invention of beer preceded the invention of bread, which provides the evidence of alcoholism during those times. Beer has been a staple for cultures around the world for centuries. In England, between 1001 and 1500 AD, ale was the common drink and was consumed by adults and children throughout the day. Wine arose a bit later, depending on where in the world an individual lived. Between 3000 to 2000 BC, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia made beer. The Sumerians drank beer with straws in order to avoid the bits of mash and grain that remained in the unfiltered alcohol mixture. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer were staples in daily diet. At that time, beer was considered to be the drink of the gods. In many cultures, it was considered a luxury reserved for the upper classes. But for ancient Greece, it was a key part of society. In some parts of Greece, drinking was considered a civic duty, and those who did not drink were considered to be lethargic and smelly. Ancient Greece was one of the earliest known centers of wine production. Winemakers established vineyards as early as 2000 BC. The Romans adopted wine production from the Greeks. The Greek poet Euripides wrote the play beha, depicting how the followers of the god Bacchus drank to excess and committed murder due to its effect. By 186 BC, the Roman Senate outlawed the performance of Bacchic rites in Italy. They believed that these followers could be a threat to public safety. China has its own complex history with alcohol. Many Chinese sources cite the consumption of natural alcohol in ancient times. This natural alcohol refers to natural fermentation of fruits and flowers. By 1630s, however, colonists began brewing their own beer using malted barley shipped from England. The first distillery in America was established on Staten Island, and hops were grown in Massachusetts to supply the breweries. Massachusetts also had a rum distillery started in 1657 in Boston. The early 1700s in England saw the production of millions of gallons of gin, alcohol flavored with juniper berries. By 1733, the London area alone produced 11 million gallons of gin. The temperance movement began in early 1800s and picked up steam throughout the century. The initial intention was to reduce alcohol intake due to concern about harmful effects of drinking to excess. By 1820s, the members pushed for total alcohol abstinence. People who joined this movement became part of the Cold Water Army. In 1862, the United States Navy removed the half-pint rum ration for sailors, and by the late 19th century, support for prohibition, the banning of manufacturing and selling of alcohol gained popularity. However, prohibition did not ban actual consumption of alcohol. The meaning of alcoholism. Alcoholism, also known as alcohol use disorder (AUD), is a broad term for any drinking of alcohol that results in mental or physical health problems. The disorder was previously divided into two types: alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence. Alcohol abuse may be defined as too much, too often alcohol dependence and inability to quit it. Alcohol abuse is a pattern of drinking that leads to the failure of fulfilling responsibilities at work, home, or school, and/or repeated drinking in situations in which it is physically hazardous. Alcohol dependence may include drinkers' increase in tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, unsuccessful attempts to cut down or even quit drinking altogether, lose control of their alcohol use, and consistently drink more and for longer than intended. The cardinal features of alcohol dependence are compulsion, which is the inability to refrain from taking that drink, loss of control over alcohol, and continued drinking no matter what the consequences. Alcoholism may be defined as a chronic disorder characterized by dependence on alcohol, repeated excessive use of alcohol beverages, the development of withdrawal symptoms on reducing or ceasing intake, morbidity that includes cirrhosis of the liver, and decreased ability to function socially and vocationally. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5, has modified some of the criteria involved in the medical definition of an alcohol use disorder, AUD. There are 11 criteria listed to help clinicians determine if the patient has AUD and how serious the problem is. A mild AUD involves experiencing 2 or 3 of the 11 symptoms for more than 1 year. A moderate AUD involves 4 or 5 of the symptoms, and a severe AUD involves 6 or more of the listed criteria. The 11 criteria for defining an AUD are: 1. Drinking more alcohol and for longer than intended. 2. Trying to cut down or stop drinking but being unsuccessful. 3. Spending a lot of time or feeling sick from a hangover or other after effects. 4. Experiencing interference in daily life and relationships because of drinking or being sick from drinking too much. 5. Having craving for alcohol. 6. Continuing to drink even though it hurt relationships with friends and family. 7. Cutting back on or giving up hobbies to consume more alcohol. 8. Repeatedly being in situations where alcohol puts one at risk of harm. 9. Having to consume more and more alcohol to experience the desired effects. 10. Continuing to consume alcohol even though it worsens a health condition including anxiety or depression. 11. Experiencing withdrawal symptoms when alcohol's effects begin to wear off. Stages of alcoholism. The stages of alcoholism can be summed up as under. Stage 1. Occasional abuse or binge drinking. The first stage of alcoholism is a general experimentation with alcohol. These drinkers may be new to different forms of alcohol and likely to test their limits. This experimental stage is commonly seen in young adults. These experimental drinkers also frequently engage in binge drinking. While they may not drink regularly, they consume exceptionally large amounts of alcohol at one time, which may be characterized as, for men, 5 or more alcoholic beverages within 2 hours, and for women, 4 or more alcoholic beverages within 2 hours. Many binge drinkers exceed this amount. This is especially true for teens who attend parties where drinking is the primary activity. An individual might think binge drinking is safe when he or she only does it occasionally, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Drinking large amounts of alcohol at one time is dangerous and can even lead to coma or death. Stage 2. Increased drinking. Drinkers leave the experimental stage when their consumption of alcohol becomes more frequent. Instead of just drinking at parties once in a while, the drinker now may find himself drinking every weekend. Increased alcohol consumption can also lead to drinking for these reasons, as an excuse to get together with friends, to alleviate stress, out of boredom, to combat sadness or loneliness. Regular alcohol use is different from moderate drinking. There's usually a higher emotional attachment to it. A moderate drinker might pair a glass of wine with a meal, while a regular drinker uses alcohol to feel good in general. As increased drinking continues, the individual becomes more dependent on alcohol and is at risk of developing alcoholism. Stage 3. Problem drinking. Frequent, uncontrolled alcohol abuse eventually leads to problem drinking. While any form of alcohol abuse is problematic, the term problem drinking refers to someone who starts experiencing the impacts of their habit. The drinker now becomes more depressed, more anxious, or starts losing sleep and may start to feel sick from heavy drinking, but enjoys its effects too much to care. Many drinkers at this stage are more likely to drink and drive or experience legal troubles as a result of their drinking. There are also specific social changes related to problem drinking. These include relationship issues, decreased social activity because of erratic behavior, sudden change in friends, difficulty conversing with strangers, etc. Stage 4. Alcohol dependence. Alcoholism has two facets: dependence and addiction. It's possible for a person to be dependent on alcohol but not yet addicted. Dependence forms after problem drinking stage. At this point, the drinker has an attachment to alcohol that takes over his regular routine. The drinker is now aware of the adverse effects but no longer has control over alcohol consumption and also develops a tolerance to drinking. As a result, he or she starts to have larger quantities to get buzzed or drunk. Another characteristic of dependence is withdrawal. Some of the withdrawal symptoms are nausea that is unrelated to a hangover, bodily tremors, sweating, severe irritability, a racing heart, trouble sleeping, and other such signs. Stage 5. Addiction and alcoholism. At this stage, the drinker no longer wants to drink just for pleasure. Alcohol addiction in this stage is characterized by a physical and psychological need to drink. People with alcohol addiction physically crave the substance and are often inconsolable until they start drinking again. They may be addicted to other drugs as well. Compulsive behaviors are prominent in addiction, and people with alcohol addiction often drink whenever and wherever they desire. Effects of alcoholism. Alcoholism adversely affects each and every aspect of human health. Some of its effects can be summed up as follows: increased risk for dementia and other neurological problems, increased risk of stroke, irregular heartbeat, digestion problems and ulcers, high blood pressure, increased risk of developing a mental illness, increased risk to develop mouth, throat, esophageal, liver, colon, and breast cancers, alcoholic hepatitis, cirrhosis of the liver, fetal alcohol syndrome, memory loss, balance problems, hearing loss, slowed reaction time, blurred vision, anxiety, restlessness, lowered inhibitions, and other such problems. History of smoking. Tobacco was introduced to France in 1556. Portugal in 1558 and Spain in 1559, while it was introduced in England in 1565. The first successful commercial crop was cultivated in Virginia in 1612 by Englishman John Rolfe. It's thought that tobacco growing started in Central America around 6000 BC. It wasn't until 5,000 years later, around 1000 BC, that the Mayan civilization began to chew and smoke the leaves of the tobacco plant, as well as mix the leaves together with herbs and plants and administer the mixture to the wounds of the sick. As the Mayans dispersed and populated different areas such as North and South Americas, they took with them their precious tobacco leaves and plants. The first European to discover smoking was Christopher Columbus. In 1531, tobacco was cultivated for the first time in Europe at Santo Domingo. By 1600, tobacco use had spread across Europe and England and was being used as a monetary standard, a practice that continued throughout the following century. By the 1700s, smoking had become more widespread and the tobacco industry had developed significantly. A fellow explorer of Columbus, Rodrigo de Jarez, shortly afterwards landed in Cuba and observed some of the inhabitants smoking the tobacco leaves. He then proceeded to partake in the smoking act himself. On his return to Spain, laden with heaps of tobacco, Jarez startled his fellow countrymen by smoking in front of them. Never in their lives had they seen a man with smoke coming out of his mouth and nose. People thought that he was possessed by the devil, and members of the Spanish Inquisition imprisoned him for several years. During his imprisonment, smoking actually became quite popular in Spain. In 1530s, a number of Europeans saw the potential for money making in tobacco, and they decided to cash in and make their wealth from cultivation of this popular plant. They began to colonize areas of Caribbean and establish large tobacco growing areas, from which they exported all the tobacco back to Europe. It is said that Sir Francis Drake was the first man to bring back a consignment of tobacco to the UK in 1573, although Sir Walter Raleigh later went on to make tobacco smoking popular in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. During the year 1586, Sir Walter Raleigh embarked on a trip to the Americas where he met Ralph Lane, who at the time was the governor of Virginia. Lane introduced Raleigh to the pleasures of smoking in a clay pipe, which was popular in that era. A year later, a number of colonists who had previously left England to settle in Virginia returned to their homeland and introduced the fashion of smoking clay pipes into your English society. Over the years, many English families traveled to Virginia to settle in order to try and make wealthy living from growing tobacco in the plantations there. Pipe smoking was also gradually becoming extremely popular in several other European countries, including Spain and France. At the beginning of 17th century, tobacco was just starting to be regularly imported into the UK, with amounts of 25,000 pounds being shipped from the Americas. By the turn of century, this amount had increased to a figure nearing 38 million pounds, and the competitive marketing and tobacco production on a large scale began to get underway. Pipe smoking and snuff had become popular in London during 17th century, and later smoking cigars became trend, but it wasn't until mid-1800s that the cigarette as we know it was manufactured. With the introduction of cigarette making machines, which at the time produced about 200 cigarettes a minute, the tobacco industry began to grow rapidly. As cigarettes were now being mass-produced, they became more easily available and affordable to a wider range of people. At first, it was mainly the soldiers who were fighting in the wars who became hooked to smoking. Sometimes, with long periods of inactivity, the soldiers became low in morale, so they were given cigarettes to smoke in order to keep up their spirits. At the start of Second World War, American President Roosevelt made tobacco a protected crop. There were shortages of tobacco in America and England as packets and packets of cigarettes were sent to troops fighting in the war. This is the time between the two world wars that smoking cigarettes became immensely popular. After the war, the soldiers went back to home and introduced cigarettes to their families, therefore strengthening the trend. Back then, medical research into the effects of smoking was still in its infancy, and it wasn't until the 1950s that first warning signals were being sound, as links between smoking and lung cancer were suddenly being reported. And the journey of smoking continues even today. Meaning of smoking. Smoking is the inhalation of smoke or burning tobacco that's used mostly in three forms: cigarettes, pipes, and cigars. The term smoking is not restricted to cigarette smoking only but includes e-cigarette, shisha, and others. Cigarette smoke contains over 4,000 different chemicals and compounds which are carcinogenic. Some of the major chemicals and compounds found in smoke are nicotine, carbon monoxide, polonium, tar, carbon disulfide, cadmium, ammonia, hydrogen, cyanide, mercury, lead, menthol, benzene, licorice, acetone, formaldehyde, coca, arsenic, and acetaldehyde. The U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention has defined different smokers as follows. The never smokers. Adults who have never smoked a cigarette or who smoked fewer than 100 cigarettes in their entire lifetime. Former smokers. Adults who have smoked at least 100 cigarettes in their lifetime but say they currently do not smoke. The non-smokers. Adults who currently do not smoke, including both former smokers and never smokers. Current smokers. Adults who have smoked 100 cigarettes in their lifetime and currently smoke cigarettes. Other types of smokers not defined by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention are light smokers. There is no consensus on a definition of light smoking. Various criteria used have included less than 1 pack a day or less than 15 cigarettes per day or less than 10 cigarettes per day and 1 to 39 cigarettes per week. Light smokers include low-rate daily smokers less than 5 cigarettes per day and chippers who consistently smoke 5 cigarettes per day on the days when they do smoke. Intermittent smokers, a broad term that covers a variety of patterns of tobacco use but is generally defined as smoking on non-daily basis. Social smokers, who limit smoking to contexts such as parties, bars, and nightclubs, often fit into this category. Intermittent smoking is also common among younger smokers and minority populations. Effects of smoking on health. Smoking harms every organ in the body and causes many different types of cancer, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, reproductive effects, and several other diseases and conditions which are discussed below. Cancer. Lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death. Compared to non-smokers, men who smoke are about 23 times more likely to develop lung cancer, and women who smoke are about 13 times more likely to develop lung cancer. Smoking causes about 90% of lung cancer deaths in men and almost 80% in women. Lung cancer is lethal with a 5-year survival rate of only about 15%. Smoking also causes many other cancers, including the pancreatic cancer, stomach cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, cervical cancer, esophageal cancer, laryngeal cancer, oral cancer, and leukemia. Cardiovascular diseases. Smoking cigarettes contributes to the development of atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a progressive hardening of the arteries caused by deposit of fatty plaques and scarring and thickening of the artery walls. Inflammation of artery walls and the development of blood clots can obstruct blood flow and cause heart attacks or strokes. Smoking also causes increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, increased peripheral vascular resistance, and increased myocardial oxygen demand. Respiratory diseases. Smoking is related to chronic coughing and wheezing among adults. Smokers are more likely than non-smokers to have upper and lower respiratory tract infections. Smoking by children and adolescents is related to impaired lung growth, chronic coughing, and wheezing. Women smoking during pregnancy reduces their baby's lung function. Smoking also causes paralysis of mucociliary transport, destruction of lung cilia, increased mucosal production, reduced pulmonary surfactant, etc. Reproductive diseases. Smoking harms many aspects of reproduction. Studies have shown that smoking makes it more difficult for women to become pregnant. Research has also shown that smoking during pregnancy causes health problems for both mothers and babies, such as pregnancy complications, premature birth, low birth weight infants, stillbirth, and sudden infant death syndrome (SIDS). Musculoskeletal system diseases. Smoking leads to increased risk of osteoporosis, increased risk of fractures with impairment of fracture healing, increased risk of herniation of an intervertebral disc. Smoking makes discs more susceptible to disease by affecting the blood supply to the discs. Smoking may impair osteoblast function. Osteoblasts are the bone-forming cells. Non-smokers produce approximately 1 centimeter of bone in 2 months, while it takes a smoker 3 months to make the same amount of bone. Other diseases and conditions caused by smoking are: smoking reduces bone density among postmenopausal women. Smoking is causally related to an increased risk of hip fractures in men and women. Smokers have 2 to 3 times the risk of developing cataracts as non-smokers. Cataracts are the leading cause of blindness worldwide. Smoking causes peptic ulcer disease. Smoking causes diminished health status, for instance, decreased productivity, increased use of medical services, and difficulty healing after surgery. With this, we conclude our today's lecture. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.